It is indeed an honor and a privilege to have been asked to come and visit Messiah. As I was thinking about preparing to come here, though, I was thinking back a little while ago to what it's like when people visit your church on Easter, and the pastor asked all the visitors to please rise, and we all know who the visitors are, and so some of them try to hide and not rise. Well, standing here, obviously, I have to rise, but really I don't feel like a visitor, having been here so often. I was laughing to myself today, even when I came in. I knew right where to go to dispatch and where to go to head to my room. And I was going to say I really appreciated the hospitality that I received until I heard this voice tell me I couldn't park where I was parking. And then I turned around and realized it was just V who was telling me that. To President Phipps, I thank you for not only the invitation, but for your friendship. To Nance, I appreciate the invitation as well. Ethan and Lindsay, I appreciate you, and it was exciting to spend some time with you at dinner and to hear about the exciting plans that you have ahead for yourselves. To my assistant director, that's her title today. My sister, Crystal, who came over from Philadelphia. It's always good to look out and have family with you. There is a possibility that my other assistant director...
Wow, just like 4 young boys.
And that's your cousin talking.
Yeah, that was family. We'll close that thing out. There's a possibility that my other assistant director, who lives in the town right next door to me, but I've not seen him for like 2 months, but he's in the area doing work, and I just found that out on the drive here today, so he might come through the door and spend time with us. You get in trouble when you start calling out names, and so I'm going to stop with the exception of one more name, to my good friend, Jordan Zimmerman, who was a student of mine for all of one semester at Geneva, and then he decided to move on to greener pastures and come here to Messiah College. And it's rare when someone transfers from your institution that you stay in touch with them. But I guess in this day of Facebook, you can stay in touch with everybody. But every time I come, Jordan and I make it an opportunity to get together. So Jordan, it's great to see you this evening as well. I want to spend some time reflecting on this question: what do these stones mean? Looking at the relationship between memory and the civil rights movement. Now, there are several things that bring me to this topic and to this evening. One is just a personal interest that I've had in civil rights, probably at least since I was in the 9th grade. And I would say at least since I was in the 9th grade, because I had a teacher by the name of Mrs. Potter, and that's actually Mrs. Potter sitting in the sanctuary of the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. But Mrs. Potter taught me, actually she was a teacher of mine in junior high as well, but taught me in 9th and 10th grade about the history of the civil rights movement, and I was just fascinated by it. And I guess even I didn't realize how fascinated I was with it. I mean, I did my freshman year of college at Morehouse because that's where Dr. King went, and that's where I wanted to be. And then when I transferred back home to Geneva, apparently I must have talked a lot about the civil rights movement amongst my colleagues, because about 13 years ago, a friend of mine who was working with the CCO was putting together a trip for a group of campus ministers. And he knew I had a passion for civil rights, and he asked me to recommend some books that they could read to go on their journey. And then about a month before their journey, he invited me to go along, and I turned him down. And I gave him all kinds of reasons why I didn't need to go. And I kind of laugh at that now, because those are all kinds of excuses people give me now for why they don't need to go. But fortunately, I went. And when I came back, I was telling a lot of people about this journey that I had, and I said there was nothing like being in those places where history happened. And when I came back and was talking to people, one of those people I talked to was Mrs. Potter. And she says, you should put together a trip. And I thought, how hard can that be? And I'm glad I did not know how hard that could be. And so 12 years ago, we put together the first of our journeys and we've been traveling strong ever since. So a personal interest brought me to this. And then it became an academic interest for me. In my program at the University of Akron, I ended up doing a rhetorical study on Jesse Jackson's speech at the '84 Democratic Convention. I remember being a 10th grader in the summer watching that convention speech. I should have known something was wrong with me then. What 10th graders are watching convention speeches and it all. And I still have that cassette tape. That'll tell you how long ago that was of that speech. And then obviously going forward, the work I'm doing now at Duquesne. We all know who this is. And if you're my friend on Facebook, you know that I'm very excited with the movie 42 that's coming out. And as I think about the civil rights movement, I can't help but think about the meaning of people like Jackie Robinson. There was a story that Hank Aaron often tells about the significance of Jackie Robinson. And he says it this way, he says, "I can remember being a kid back in Mobile, sitting on the back porch when an airplane flew over. I told my father when I grew up I was going to be a pilot. You know what he said? He said, 'Ain't no colored pilots.' So I told him I'd be a ball player. And he said, 'Ain't no colored ball players.' There were a lot of things blacks couldn't do back then. There weren't any colored pilots. There weren't any colored ball players in the major leagues. So it was hard to have those dreams." And then he goes on to talk about, though, when Jackie Robinson came to Mobile and he had a chance to meet him for the first time, both he and his father. Now, Hank Aaron says, "I don't remember everything that he said, but it really didn't matter what he said. He was standing right there. My father took me to see Jackie play at an exhibition game. After that day, he never told me that I couldn't be a ball player. I was allowed to dream after that." Thinking about the legacy of figures like Jackie Robinson, of course we know what he did in the sport of Major League Baseball. But Dr. King said it this way. He said, "Back in the days when integration wasn't fashionable, he underwent the trauma and humiliation and the loneliness which comes with being a pilgrim. He walked the lonesome byways on the high road to freedom. He was a senator before there was sit-ins. He was a freedom rider before there were freedom rides." So when I think about this idea of memory, I'm drawn to not only figures like Jackie Robinson, I'm drawn to the sacred text as well. This image is a monument in Selma, Alabama, and it sits on the opposite end of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And if you know anything about what occurred in Selma, there was an event there on March 7th, 1965, called Bloody Sunday, in which marchers were setting out on a 55-mile walk from Selma to Montgomery to demonstrate for voting rights. And on that first attempt, the marchers were beaten by police officers. But that did not stop them, that did not deter them. After 2 more attempts, they would eventually make that successful march. And when they crossed over that bridge, think with me now, we can recall in the book of Joshua about memory and about the importance of responding to the acts of God in history. In Joshua, the 4th chapter, we read these words, "In the future, when your children shall ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' you will tell them how Israel crossed over the Jordan." I can't help but think about the work that I've been blessed to be a part of in terms of civil rights tourism. It's about remembering these stones and what these stones mean. That's my other director of the tour up there on the right, my son Bryce, from several years ago. He's talking with Joanne Bland. And one of the reasons I really like this picture is Joanne was 11 years old during the Selma to Montgomery march. She was on that bridge as an 11-year-old the day that that beating occurred. Joanne has remained in Selma to tell the story of what happened during that movement. Here she's handing my son a rock and telling him the story about what those stones mean. And as I was preparing that picture, it dawned on me as well, my son is 11 years old at the time that picture was taken. This is another image of Joanne. So when we think about stones and what those stones mean, they're a sign, they're a form of remembrance, a form of commemorative practice that can exist. And they function for several reasons. One reason they function is to provide a testimony, telling of God's faithfulness to his people. Part of that testimony is also telling the story of the power of God to deliver his people from bondage. They serve as a reminder to people of who God is and that God is always faithful to his promise. Now, when we think about civil rights and civil rights education, there was a study I read that came out a couple of years ago that really talked about the dismal state, if you will, of civil rights education. It said that at the time this study was conducted, that only about 2% of high school seniors could answer even basic questions about Brown versus Board. Don't worry, I'm not going to quiz you this evening. That 16 states at the time of this report don't require any civil rights education whatsoever in their curriculum. And another 19 have minimum coverage at all. It said that if you were to ask most people, not just students, they could tell you two names: Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. But even there, with those two names, sometimes people can't take you beyond what those individuals accomplished. There's a new book that's out now called The Rebellious Life of Rosa Parks that talks about the activism that she had throughout her entire life, prior to the Montgomery arrest, as well as following right up to her passing. Oftentimes, though, we tend to only think of her, again, in a very passive kind of a way, and in fact, we've allowed a lot of myths to surround us about the nature of her arrest. Recently, Mrs. Parks was commemorated, though, in the Statuary Hall in the Capitol with this statue. So if Rosa Parks is one name, we know that the other name is Martin Luther King. And when we think of whether it's Mrs. Parks or Mrs. King or Dr. King, we tend to think of them in these iconic sort of ways, and they should be revered for what they've done. We think of Dr. King at the forefront of marches. It's tough not to think of people as larger than life when they are larger than life on the National Mall. This is the recent edition there in Washington, D.C. And while those images are important and deserve to be on the commemorative landscape, we do ourselves a disservice if we continue to put them on this pedestal that's beyond the reach of you and I. Because then it somehow makes us feel as though, well, I'm not a Rosa Parks, I'm not a Martin Luther King, I can't make a difference. And what we forget is that these were everyday people, just like you and I. Ordinary people who did extraordinary things. While I love listening to speeches and sermons of Dr. King, I love even more images like that. I'm not sure that was really a real shot or not. But this is Dr. King spending time with the people. So there are three things that I want to focus on just a little bit during our time tonight. One is, that I've already mentioned, ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Second thing that I want to talk about in terms of what these stones mean are some of the martyrs of the movement, those who gave their lives for us to have the very freedoms that we have today. And then last but not least, I want to talk about the role of faith, particularly the hand of God in history, what John Lewis often refers to as the spirit of history, and how the spirit of history used these men and women to accomplish a mighty thing. So who were some of these ordinary people? I like focusing on the young people, even though people such as King aren't as old as we think they are. In this image, that ought to be familiar to us, we see the Little Rock Nine, those 9 students who in 1957 integrated Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. I'm always fascinated with the role that these 14, 15, 16-year-olds step up and took their place in history. You know, again, I said sometimes we think of these people as larger than life, and sometimes they are. This is Minnie Jean Brown Trickey, one of the Little Rock Nine, standing with a statue of herself on the Capitol grounds in Little Rock, Arkansas. It's kind of neat. This is the only set of statues in the South dedicated to figures of the civil rights movement on a Capitol grounds. Minnie Jean says when she was living in Little Rock, she likes to ride by there every once in a while and watch the kids swinging on her arms or running through the statues. And every once in a while she'll get out and talk to them. You know, again, sometimes we think of these people as these icons. I'll never forget being with Minnie Jean one time, and someone asked her, because people always want to know, did you ever meet Martin Luther King? And someone asked her, did you ever meet Martin Luther King? And she says, yes. And they said, what did you think of him? She said, we thought he was cute. And people just kind of chuckled, and then they said, well, think about it. She was 15, 16 years old. He was, you know, in his late 20s, good-looking guy, could talk really good. They thought he was cute. These 4 college students from North Carolina A&T, who on February 1st of 1960 had enough of the system of racial segregation and separation. And so they went down to their local Woolworth and launched a campaign that spread all over this country. They are commemorated not only in this iconic photo, but with a statue as well on campus. That Woolworth is now the National Civil Rights Center and Museum. There you can see the counter, parts of the counter that they sat at. This actual piece of the counter here is on display at the Museum of American History at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. Another one of those images that I really love, thinking again about children leading the way. In May of 1963, in April of 1963, Dr. King would come to Birmingham, Alabama, at the request of Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth to lead the campaign there. And while Dr. King and Reverend Shuttlesworth were passionate about what they were doing, for a variety of reasons, including fear, the older adults in Birmingham were hesitant to get involved. One of the strategies of SCLC was to fill the jails. Reverend James Bevel, who was an associate of King's in SCLC, said, I know how we can fill the jails. And he said to Dr. King, Doc, don't ask me how I'm going to fill them, just know that I can fill them. And so what Bevel decided to do was in May of 1963 to get the children involved. And you had children as young as 5 and 6 years old, all the way up to college-age students who went to jail, not by the hundreds, but by the thousands, and broke the back of segregation in Birmingham. It's important that we remember these kinds of stories. There's a great documentary that's out that talks about this. And until I had a child of my own, that having a child of my own, that documentary really began to speak to me in a way that I can't find, even to this day, hard to put into words. But the role of children in history. Here is an image taken from Kelly Ingram Park, which is, if you can recall any of the iconic images you see of the firemen with the hoses or the policemen with the police dogs sicking them on children, that was in Kelly Ingram Park in Birmingham. And here are statues there. Children saying quite simply, I ain't afraid of your jails. And here's another image of that. John Lewis, at the time of the movement, head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee for a period, now a congressman from Atlanta. He talked about what it was like growing up in a Jim Crow society. And he said that his parents and grandparents always told him, that's just the way it is. Maybe one day it'll be better, but as for now, don't get in the way. And John Lewis said, that just didn't sit right with me. And so I went out and found a way to get in the way, to get in trouble. And he said it was good trouble that I got in trouble for. And he said, if anything, that's one of the lessons that we need to learn today. It's important to get in trouble, good trouble. And what he's talking about there is the idea of civic engagement. We see examples that have gone on before us. It's important that young people know that you've got the power to change the world. You're not the leaders of tomorrow, you're the leaders of right now. No one's going to give it to you, you've got to step up and take it. This image here, I love this woman. This is Mrs. Amelia Boynton Robinson. She was one of the leading advocates in the Selma to Montgomery campaign. She helped organize an organization there called the Dallas County Voters League. Mrs. Amelia Boynton Robinson is still with us, thankfully. She's 102 years old. 102 years old. I was in Selma, Alabama recently for an annual time of remembrance that they have there called Jubilee. And during this time, there are a lot of tributes and honors that go forth to people. And of course, they're going to pay tribute and honor to Mrs. Robinson. But I'll never forget that Saturday evening banquet after probably about the umpteenth speaker had gotten up and said, "We stand on your shoulders," and those kinds of things. Mrs. Robinson stood up and said, "Get off my shoulders. Do the work. Do your own work." In other words, she wasn't being, disrespectful in terms of, not appreciating the praise that she was given, but she said, now is not the time to praise and to put up monuments. I'm still here. I'm 102, but I'm still here. It's still time to keep working. In the midst of that work, there are many who made sacrifices, who went to jail, who lost jobs, who were beaten, and some who even made the ultimate sacrifice, and that is death. This is a memorial wheel to the martyrs of the Civil Rights Movement, which is located on the grounds of the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama. Thinking about this memorial, there are several tributes that you see on that back wall. Both the back wall as well as the table that you see in front of you are covered with water. The quote they attribute to Dr. King, but he's speaking from the book of Amos, until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And all around that wheel, you read not only the historic events of the movement, but you read about people who gave their all. No greater love does one have than to lay down their life for others. One of those names that's important to remember is Emmett Till, young boy from Chicago who had gone south to Money, Mississippi, and was murdered. Speaking of her son's death, Mrs. Till said it this way. She said, in the time following his murder, the Lord would come and speak to me. She said, the Lord would tell me that Emmett was not mine, that he was his, and that without the shedding of blood, there could be no redemption. That God had a higher calling for Emmett. And she said that's the way that she was able to go on in the face of losing her 14-year-old son to a brutal murder. We think in September 15th of 1963, to be exact, 4 young girls in Sunday school at their church, 16th Street Baptist Church, when a bomb would explode, injuring many and killing these 4, Denise McNair, Cynthia Wesley, Addie Mae Collins, and Carol Robertson. We're reminded of Freedom Summer in 1964, when college students from all over this country would descend on the state of Mississippi, seeking to get voting rights and citizenship rights for residents of that state. And in doing so, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner would be brutally murdered. Jimmy Lee Jackson, whose murder in Marion, Alabama, just outside of Selma, Alabama, would be the catalyst that would trigger the Selma to Montgomery march. There had been demonstrations taking place in that region for months, and during one of those demonstrations, the marchers in Marion would be set upon by local law enforcement. Jimmy Lee Jackson was trying to protect his mother and his grandmother, or his mother and his grandfather, and for that act he would be shot, and several days later he would pass away in the city of Selma. In protest and in anger, honestly, for another murder, a murder which they knew was going to go unconvicted, they decided that they would have a march. In fact, they said, let's take his body from Selma to Montgomery and lay his body on the steps of the Capitol in protest. Now, they obviously did not take his body, but they did march in protest in that Selma to Montgomery march. I've already talked about Bloody Sunday and that event breaking up into violence. 2 days later, or in the wake of Bloody Sunday, Dr. King and others would call for masses of people to come to Selma, people of conscience and goodwill. And folks from all over this country, clergy from all over this country, would come. One of those who would come is this gentleman here, Reverend James Reeb, who was a minister from Boston. During a march on the Tuesday, called Turnaround Tuesday now in the history books, James Reeb, following that march, would be heading out to dinner with a couple of other clergy members. They would be attacked and beaten, and several days later, Reverend Reeb would pass away. Seeing the events of Bloody Sunday on her television up in Detroit, a woman by the name of Viola Luisa, not knowing a soul in Selma, would say there's an injustice down there and I've got to go and help right that wrong. And so she would come and take part in the Selma to Montgomery campaign, marching all the way from Selma to Montgomery. And then following that march, as marchers were being returned to their various homes, a group of Klansmen would pull alongside her vehicle, firing into it, killing her instantly. This is a memorial to Mrs. Louisa that's on the spot where her car came to rest. You'll notice in the background that there's a fence that goes around that, because when the marker was first put up, it was repeatedly vandalized by people. And so they put that fence up to protect her. And she's not buried there, it's important that you know that, but to protect the marker. And her daughter had said the first time she saw that, even in death, some of these people are so filled with hate that they won't allow my mother to be at peace. Another gentleman who would see the injustices in Selma, a minister from New Hampshire, Jonathan Daniels. He would come not only for the march, but he would stay in the region to work. And while doing some of that work in nearby Lowndes County, Jonathan Daniels would be gunned down and lose his life in the freedom struggle. It's important that we remember Jonathan Daniels. And of course, Dr. King, who in April of 1968, while in Memphis, Tennessee, advocating on the behalf of sanitation workers, while standing on this balcony outside of room 306 at the Lorraine Motel, which is now the National Civil Rights Museum. A little after 6 in the evening, a shot would ring out, killing Dr. King instantly. There we see on this memorial marker to Dr. King the words of Genesis. They conspired against him to slay him, and they said to one another, "Behold, this dreamer cometh. Come now, therefore, and let us slay him, and we shall see what becomes of his dreams." We remember these people, each and every one of them, and the many other countless names, known and unknown, for the sacrifices that they made for us to be here today. Now, there are challenges to memory, and I want to touch just briefly on 3 of those. It can be pretty tricky stuff. It's a pretty contested past. One example of that contested past is, what do you do in a region of the country when you've got what appear to be these competing histories of Civil War, i.e. Jeff Davis, and civil rights, Martin Luther King? How do we reconcile that history on the commemorative landscape? One of the cities I think that's really trying hard to do that is Selma. Selma, known as a place of Civil War, rich in Civil War memory, but also a place rich in civil rights history. And so they've adopted many years ago as their motto, from Civil War to civil rights and beyond. And part of that beyond is the idea of how do we together reconcile and wrestle with our history. There are some, though, who would prefer that this history be forgotten. And that's another thing, another challenge that we have. What happens when the people who were alive that made this history no longer are on the scene? This gentleman here is Mr. Bob Mance. Bob is he's standing in front directly. His hand is in front of an image of John Lewis. This is John Lewis leading the Bloody Sunday March in Selma that I've mentioned a few times. Interesting to look at these images. You can see John Lewis rocking a backpack. Backpacks were cool, I guess, back in 1965 too. So everything that was, cool back then is coming back now. Behind John Lewis is Bob Mance, the younger version of Bob Mance. You can't really see it in this picture, but trust me, Bob has some very high water pants on. And Bob assured me that that was the fashion back then. When I say high water, I mean, I was like, Bob, you might as well wear shorts, they were so high. Bob passed away a few years ago, as have a number of those authentic voices. And if we don't take the time to get to know this history, while the people who made this history are in our midst, we're missing out on a very, very valuable resource. And I talked about this idea of forgetting. There are many people who would say, why talk about the past? The past is the past. It's best left there. It's too painful. Don't want to talk about it. In fact, there are many who would like to erase the past from the commemorative landscape. What you're looking at here is a store in Money, Mississippi. Now, I mentioned the name earlier, Emmett Till. It was at this store back in 1955 that Emmett Till would have this altercation that would later lead or result in his murder. This building, this was taken, I think at least 6 years ago now, and you can see that the roof is about gone from this. There are those in Mississippi who wanted to purchase this property and to find some way to revitalize it, to remember the history that occurred there. There are others who would prefer that this thing just fall in and that we forget what happened there. It's important, as I have repeatedly said, that we remember. John Lewis says, our history is a precious resource, and we must do all we can to preserve it and to ensure its accuracy. Dr. Terrence Roberts, one of the Little Rock Nine, puts it this way. He says, if a dialogue is to begin, we need to know as much as possible about what's going on in society. We need to have an informed historical perspective. It's important that we know what came before so we understand how to handle what's going on now in order to make for a better tomorrow. Journalist Bill Moyers says it this way: as Americans, we seem to know everything about the last 24 hours, but nothing about the last 60 years. Winston Churchill, the longer you can look back, the further you can see forward. Last but not least, Os Guinness, in A Free People's Suicide, puts it this way: we live in an age of instant gratification and satisfaction, where even relationships are renewable in short-term increments. Gone is the marriage of till death do us part. Today in America, this commitment has shrunk to as long as love lasts, where even marriages are severed with a text message. We obviously know who this is or who these people are, and we know what event is being represented here. And regardless of one's politics, we know that what the country saw in 2008 and what they saw again in 2012 was indeed a historic occasion. But you really can't understand or appreciate the history if you don't understand and appreciate these images. You know, there was a time in places in this country when you went to register to vote, you would take a literacy test. And if you were fortunate enough to pass that, sometimes you couldn't pass it, even though the person giving you the test couldn't read. But if you passed that written exam, they'd give you a couple of other exams. One of those exams they might give you is to show you a jar of jelly beans and to ask you how many jelly beans are in that jar. And then you've got to give a correct answer in order to vote. And guess what? It doesn't matter what answer you're going to give, that's not the correct answer. My wife says I'm always trying to teach something. I was lecturing in the state of Indiana a few years ago, right around the Easter season as well. And I was traveling through this very small airport that had one little security thing, you know, so it was a super small airport. And I forgot that I had a jar of jelly beans that I was using for a demonstration in my bag. And they stopped me and pulled me aside and wanted to investigate the jelly beans. And they just figured because it was Easter that I had a love for jelly beans. And I said, no. I said, I was doing this lecture on voting rights. So here I am with two of the people from TSA and a couple of other people as they're putting their shoes back on. And I'm teaching a lesson on voting rights and how many jelly beans are in the jar. And they kept trying to guess. And I was like, it doesn't matter what answer you give. And then finally the TSA person said, if you don't tell me how many are in that jar, I'm not letting you through. So I made up some numbers. She was happy. Or you might be given the soap test and asked how many bubbles are in a bar of soap. Now imagine the insult that you would feel as a citizen of this country, paying taxes to this country and not being allowed to vote because you couldn't answer how many bubbles are in a bar of soap or how many jelly beans are in a jar. Those are the kind of experiences that this woman, Fannie Lou Hamer, went through in Mississippi, where in 1964, as part of that Freedom Summer, she would get involved with SNCC to the point that she would get into leadership in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and would go to Atlantic City to the Democratic Convention and would give a speech on that floor about being sick and tired of being sick and tired. It's because of people like Fannie Lou Hamer that we have moments like we saw in 2008 and 2012. Those who know me know that I love sports. We all know who that is. Tiger Woods, Masters Week, by the way. I wonder though, do we know, other than the people in this room who've gone on the tour, who that is? No, that's not Tiger's dad. And no, that's not my dad either. This is a gentleman by the name of William Powell. Mr. Powell grew up in Minerva, Ohio, which is near Canton, Ohio. And as a young boy, he heard about them building a golf course. He didn't even know what golf was, but he wanted to go see it. And he said, at first I thought this was the most boring thing. He says, as I watched it through the hedges, he goes, men would hit this ball with a stick, and then they'd walk to it and they'd hit it again. He said, but then the more I watched it, the more fascinating it became. And so he would eventually take up the game of golf. His golf career would be interrupted briefly when he would go off and serve his country in the military. But when he would return home to Canton, Ohio, not a course would allow him to play. Dr. Powell didn't get bitter, he got better. He found a plot of land, found some people to go in on him with that land, and built his own golf course, where in 1946, one full year before Jackie Robinson would integrate Major League Baseball, Dr. Powell would open the first 9 holes of Clearview Golf Course, which is now an 18-hole golf course in Canton, Ohio. It is the only course in the world built, designed, owned, and operated by an African American. Dr. Powell would pass away a few years ago, but his daughter Renee, who's the second black woman to have ever played on the LPGA Tour, now operates that course. Dr. Powell likes to say about Clearview, which is what I think is a message about the movement in and of itself. Clearview is a place where the only color that matters is the color of the greens. Last but not least, I want to talk about faith in the movement. The Civil Rights Movement, to me, represented a great time where the people of God rose up together against injustice and sought to right a wrong. One of my heroes of the faith from this time is a gentleman by the name of Reverend C.T. Vivian. Rev and I get to talk from time to time. He lives in Atlanta now. One of the, again, iconic images you see of Rev is this one here on the courthouse steps in Selma, where he's having a confrontation with that gentleman in the helmet, is Jim Clark, a notorious sheriff there in Selma. Shortly after this picture was taken, Clark would punch Reverend Vivian across the mouth. I was asking Rev one time, I said, you know, it's no accident to me that a number of you in the movement were pastors. I said, but Rev, you never pastored a church. Did you miss something about not doing that? And he says, some people are called to the ministry to pastor churches. Some people are called to the ministry to do missions. He said, I was called to the ministry for the purpose of the movement. I was called to the ministry for the purpose of the movement. And then he expanded on that. He said, you know, to me, he says, when I think about the movement was a battle to see whose God was God. Is God the God of those of us fighting for freedom, justice, and equality? Or was God the God of the segregationists? He said, because what you got to remember is they went to church too. They prayed too. They thought that they were on God's side. And he said, of course, we think God is the God of justice and equality that we were fighting for. Back almost where I began with Dr. King. When we think of the movement, again, we often think of two names, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. But even there, I think we do Dr. King a disservice. We see him as a preacher and a civil rights activist, when that dichotomization is really a false one. Because Dr. King was not a preacher on Sunday, but a civil rights activist Monday through Saturday. He was a preacher, a Christian, living out the implications of the gospel every day of his life. He saw the movement as Reverend Vivian had described the movement. But even there, Dr. King, reflecting on his role in the movement, said it this way in his letter from a Birmingham jail. He said, "One day the South will recognize its real heroes. They will be the James Merediths with the noble sense of purpose that enables them to face jeering and hostile mobs, and with the agonizing loneliness that characterizes the life of a pioneer. They will be old, oppressed, battered Negro women, symbolized in the 72-year-old woman in Montgomery, who rose up with a sense of dignity and with her people that decided not to ride segregated buses, and responded with ungrammatical profundity to the one who inquired about her weariness. My feet is tired, but my soul is at rest. They will be the young high school and college students, the young ministers of the gospel and a host of their elders, courageously and nonviolently sitting in at lunch counters and willing to go to jail for conscience sake. One day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for what is best in the American dream and the most sacred values of our Judeo-Christian heritage." And so when I think about what these stones mean, I'm reminded of the words in the book of Hebrews about that great cloud of witnesses. This is an image taken from the former location of the National Voting Rights Museum and Institute in Selma, Alabama. In the background, you can see faintly the Edmund Pettus Bridge. In the foreground, we see written on this window names of veterans, some well-known and others not as well-known, of the civil rights movement. Unfortunately, this particular museum has been forced to close because of it's sitting right on a river bank, if you will, that's eroding away. And so they had, for safety reasons, had to close that. But I was blessed to be there on many occasions. And one occasion I was there was a very nice sunny day, but there were still some clouds in the sky. And when I first walked into that room, it looked as though those names were sitting on the clouds. And I said to the operator of that museum, I said, "I know that this was not accidental that you did this." I said, "But again, I can't help but think on the words of Hebrews. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us." Thank you.
Just a few minutes for a question or two. If anybody would like to ask a question, if that's okay with you, Dr.
Sure.
Allen. We didn't work that out ahead of time, but nothing like putting you on the spot there. I'm sure he gets questions in his classroom every day. He's used to this sort of thing. Anybody have questions or comments you'd like to make?
Yes.
You're reading from King, where he links, as so often he does, the American dream and the Judeo-Christian heritage. When we read these things, like King's letter, famous letter from Birmingham jail, well, he sounds like he's from a different age. Any thoughts? This is sort of maybe a tough and unfair question, but as you think about what you've encouraged us to think about, linking the past with the present, taking encouragement, taking inspiration from the past, how does it work in that particular area? How might even that kind of project of using, as King did, the kind of combined energies, civic energies as well as religious energies, does that have any hope going forward, you think?
Yeah, well, I think if I understand your question correctly, and I'm a politician when I'm not a teacher, so if I don't answer the question you asked, it's because I answered the question that I wish you would have asked. One of the things I think about, I was actually just having this conversation with a student yesterday. What's awesome is how the Word of God is timeless. It's just as relevant as it was 50 years ago as it is right now. Particularly, we were talking about King's Beyond Vietnam speech. And I gave it to her to read. She was working on a project on King. And I said, now as you read that, I said, if you would have taken your mind back, even a few years ago to, the war in Iraq or Afghanistan, I said, where it says Vietnam, you could just kind of switch some of, those terms out, and it's just as relevant, for better or worse, today. At the time of King's life and throughout King's ministry in the movement, he saw himself as working against what he called the triple evils: racism, war, and poverty. And there are other evils as well that exist, but those three are still amongst us as well. I think one of the challenges is for us to have the courage, as John Lewis said, to get in the way, to see a wrong and to step up. And stepping up doesn't always mean that it's going to be popular. I tell people, no disrespect whatsoever, but I said, I'm not really sure that Martin Luther King died from an assassin's bullet on the balcony at the Lorraine, and they look at you kind of strange when you say that. And I said, no, trust me, I know he was shot there and that he died. I said, but if you read enough historical accounts, everybody says he died in my arms. Now, he couldn't have died in all those people's arms unless they were just up there around the balcony passing him around. But it's, you become popular. Reverend Lowry said it this way. He said, it's easier to build a monument than a movement. When you're in the midst of doing some work, particularly work that can get you in trouble, work that can get you killed, you're not necessarily popular. But I've learned in Micah 6:8, what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, love mercy, and to walk humbly. And I think that's what a lot of these veterans of the movement saw themselves doing every day, was living that out. We call our tour that we do Returning to the Roots of Civil Rights. That for a reason. It's not just a time to go places and take nice pictures and get t-shirts and coffee mugs and that kind of thing and then forget it. But it's when you return to your respective communities that you come from, that you look for ways to get involved, that you look for ways to get in the way. And I think as people of God, I know as people of God, we're called to be those change agents in society. We can take great inspiration and great hope and great encouragement from the examples, whether it's King, whether it's those young college students who went to Mississippi during Freedom Summer, those on the Freedom Rides. We know now, 40, 50, 60 years later, how that turned out. They didn't know then, but they knew who held the future. I realize that was a long answer to a short question. I told you I'm a politician.
Other questions?
Yes, sir.
In one of the pictures showing the young students, young school students.
Yes, from the Children's March.
There was a poster behind that said 24-hour television. And one of the, how much do you think was the influence or the impact of the media? Because a lot of these, there was planning behind it, and the aim was to have the media focus on.
Oh yeah.
Transmitted around the world, which then became an embarrassment to American delegations.
Oh yeah, Birmingham of itself. One of the reasons Abernathy wanted, Shuttlesworth wanted King and SCLC to come, is he said, well, first of all, just the oppression here is so bad, but we've got a director of public safety who is reckless and who will do things that will make for good television, so to speak. And if you're going to so dramatize the issue, that was one of the criticisms that King and others got, is that you're causing violence. They weren't causing violence, but that was the way that people like Bull Connor responded. But that drew attention. That drew additional support. That also drew criticism. I mean, how are we, the Kennedy administration at the time, how are you going to talk about peace and justice and equality abroad, and this is happening in your very own land? It makes you look hypocritical, and so you need to do things that are going to address that apparent hypocrisy. So, oh no, they knew clearly. Former Ambassador Andrew Young talks quite extensively about the role of the media, and he says, we appreciated you guys. We knew that we had to make sure that action happened in a certain amount of time, and that you were there to capture it so that it could get onto the news. I mean, that was one of the things that caught the attention of Viola Luisa all the way up in Detroit when she saw that beating on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And so, oh yeah, definitely. Now, one of the things that can get you in trouble, though, with memory and images, I love the Eyes on the Prize video series. I think it's one of the greatest documentaries done, and there are other great ones. Everyone has their flaws, but sometimes you can get tricked when you look at that. For example, in Little Rock in 1957, we see those howling mobs outside the school. And for years growing up watching that, I thought, well, wow, once they got into school, it had to be better. No, it wasn't. It was worse. But there were no cameras inside the school to record and tell you how bad it really was. It's only as these 9 have come forward over the years with their accounts of how bad it was. So, sometimes you can get tricked. Minnie Jean says it this way. She says, if somebody didn't see it happen, then it didn't happen, kind of a thing. So at the same time, there was good and bad to that. Yes, sir.
You mentioned a study at the beginning about how students aren't aware of the civil rights movement, or they're unfamiliar with it, or they only can name King and Parks. Yet the civil rights movement is such a fixture in, every school curriculum, right? There always is a section or a unit on the civil rights movement. So where's the disconnect, I guess? Where? And let me give you an example. As a history professor, I once asked my students to write down the 10 most popular figures in American history who were not presidents. And 4 of the 10, or maybe 3 of the 10, one was Harriet Tubman, and King and Parks were on the list, right? But where's the disconnect happening between the fact that it is now required in state social studies and history standards to have Martin Luther, or the civil rights movement discussed, but yet we hear study after study that students aren't aware of this stuff? Any
Yeah, well, I think
on that?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things to consider. I know I did mention students, and that's who that report focuses on. It's not just students, though.
Yeah.
So there are some older students that don't quite get it. I think there are a couple of things. Even though I see a better presence in some of the textbooks, it was mentioned that I'm on the school board. I was looking at a textbook the other day that was under consideration. It was a literature book. And while it had more names than, let's say, the textbook that was there when I had, outside of that subject-specific class, it only had 3 images. And one was Parks, one was King, and the other one was Mrs. King, because they were telling kind of a story about Montgomery through her. One of the things one of the struggles I'll see, I'll give you a very practical example, is sometimes what we do at the teacher preparation level, we give you enough, I'm not surprised that Harriet Tubman was on that list, because I'm sure that's a popular name during Black History Month. And sometimes we'll carry her over to Women's History Month too. But we only talk about the same names over and over. And so they can remember those. But even though they remember those names, if you were to start probably asking them more in-depth questions about Harriet Tubman, Parks, or King, they might not get it. Sometimes there are assumptions or leaps as teachers that we make, well-intended, but also misinformed. Perfect example is this. There's a social studies teacher in my school district who was talking about the Little Rock Nine. They weren't in the textbook, but he was adding that, so it was a good move. And he starts talking about everything that they went through. And I think he had saw a documentary that featured some of the 9, and he even talked about what they went through inside the school. So he's knocking it out the park so far. Then he says, you know, I bet you to this day, his teacher's wife, he said, I bet you to this day, they don't like white people. That's where he failed. My niece was sitting in the class, and she'd gone on the tour, and she raised her hand, and I won't call out the teacher's name, but she politely let him know that that was an incorrect assumption. In fact, she told him about several of the Little Rock Nine who at varying times in their lives have been married to a white spouse, and his jaw was just kind of dry. Then she proceeded to unpack some other things for him. Now, this is a 10th grader unpacking this for the guy with the college degree. So, I mean, he was doing some good things. He started out well, and then he just kind of, made this leap. But I think there are other reasons as well, and I'd love to talk with you further and get you there are 2 links on that report that I mentioned from Southern Poverty as well. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned earlier that there were those who were, basically wanting to just forget about the issue of civil rights and not even remember.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the reasons you encountered for people wanting to forget, and what would you suggest as, a first step for people who really want to get involved after perhaps they've gone on your tour or read or kind of taken some initiative? What would you suggest for people who really want to do something but may not know what they can do to?
Yeah. Well, I think to the first part, there are many reasons why people want to forget. For some, it's so painful of a past. I mean, when you start talking about a 14-year-old boy being brutally murdered, that's painful stuff to watch, and so folk want to turn away, and I can understand some of that. For some, it might be a level of embarrassment, because like there's an iconic image from Little Rock when Elizabeth Eckford is walking to school by herself, and you see this mob of people behind her yelling at her, and the people who are local know who those folk are. And so imagine now seeing your mother or your grandmother. That's embarrassing, to people. Some feel that we've come a long way. My goodness, the president is black. We're post-racial. Get over it. We've overcome. Stop singing we shall. We have. Kind of thing. So, I mean, there are any number of reasons why people don't want to talk about it. When I say people don't want to talk about it, I mean people of every stripe and hue. I mean, I go round and round with some people about, who tell me they don't want to watch Roots. Whatever. As far as to the second part of how one can get involved, I think there are many ways. I mean, there are opportunities all around us, and sometimes we just fall into those opportunities. If you would have told me 13, 14 years ago that I'd be standing here answering your question after having led a tour for 12 years, I didn't even know there was such a thing as civil rights tourism. And now this has become my life. I mean, that's one way to get involved. Telling the stories, again, that whole idea of what do these stones mean? Telling this story to your children, to your nieces, to your nephews, to your cousins, to the neighbors' kids. Sharing the importance of what happened in the past. I tell, when I'm talking to high school and junior high school students all the time, I say, you take it for granted that you can sit in the classrooms that you sit in, or that you can have the friends that you have. There was a time when that was not only not possible, that was not legal to do. That when you travel, you don't have to stop and think about, when I get tired, where am I going to lay my head? Where can I go to a restroom? Where can I eat? You take those things for granted, and I think we take them for granted at our peril if we don't remember from whence we've come. So I think there are any number of ways to engage. One just needs to open up their eyes to look around them.